Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we're taking a look at one of the brand new decks just released into the game, Royal Rebels, thanks to the release of the new mini box, Heavy Metal Scream. So Royal Rebels have a couple of interesting skills that can support them. Today we're going to be looking at kind of their flagship skill, that being Royal Rebels Heavy Drive. So this skill can be used if the only monsters with 1400 or more attack in your deck are Fiend type. So that's fine. It basically just stops us from running a lot of the 1500 attackers, but it also does mean we cannot play the Canaan Aqua engine. If we want to play the Aqua engine, we would have to use either Grace Princess Kana or we would have to use Bubbly Elf. We cannot use Canaan. Requirement none. Increase the level of one level 4 light attribute face-up effect monster on your field by 1 until the end of the turn. Now notably, this does say level 4 light attribute effect monster. So it doesn't say it has to be a fiend, and it does say it has to be an effect monster, so we can't use this on the 1500 vanilla, but we can use this on non-fiend level 4 light monsters. If you were the player going first and activated this effect, return one card from your hand to the deck. So this is a little bit frustrating, because we don't really want to be punished for going first, and this isn't if it's the first turn of the duel and using it, this is if you went first during this duel, for the rest of the duel, if ever you want to use this skill, you have to lose a card from your hand. Now, that's not terrible, because we do have a card that will show in a little bit called Palace Gargoyle that we will be looking at, and that card basically does the same thing. We lose a card from our hand, it gains a level. So it's, at worst, turns your non-Palace Gargoyle level 4 light effect monsters into Palace Gargoyle. But at best, the other effect, which is if we go second, is so much stronger. If you're the player going second and activate this effect, you can send a Royal Rebels Heavy Metal from your deck to the graveyard. Now, the reason this is so good is because, one, this is not a mandatory effect, which means we can choose to not send our Heavy Metal to the grave, which is pretty good. That means we don't have to have a Heavy Metal in deck to activate and resolve this skill. On top of the fact, we do have cards like Royal Rebels Rocker, which does have the effect to get a level 6 or higher Fiend monster from our graveyard back to our hand, which means if we have Rocker, we can simply send Heavy Metal to grave and then get it back with Rocker and then go into Heavy Metal. So it's a pretty good way to almost tutor out your Heavy Metal, which is very, very good. So what does this deck do? Basically, it is entirely built to facilitate activating and resolving Royal Rebels Heavy Metal. So a 2500 attack monster is fantastic, exactly the attack we want to be hitting. 0 defense, so if anything changes our battle position, we are basically murked, there's nothing we can do about it. But its effect is pretty good. During the turn, you normal summon this card by attributing a level 5 or higher monster. Again, that requirement is pretty rough. That's why we're using our skill to try and boost our monster's levels. We can choose one face-up level 8 or lower monster with the lowest level on our opponent's field. This card gains attack equal to that monster's attack until the end of the turn. Destroy that monster. So this is a very, very strong effect. Being able to pop a monster is always really good, because that is a good way to get to our opponent's life points, as well as gaining a load of attack means we can attack over a bunch of threats. The issue this card has is that it will only be able to target the lowest level monster on the opponent's field. Now, if they have all tied level, you do get to pick. But if your opponent just has a level 4 next to their Dragius, you have to pop the level 4, which means you'll then have to attack into the Dragius and hope your opponent doesn't have a back row to mess you up, such as Widespread Ruin. But outside of that, Royal Rebels Heavy Metal is still a pretty decent boss monster. Being able to pop a monster is always going to be really good, and being able to gain a load of attack is always going to be really good. And as you can see, this card is limit 3, which means we cannot play it alongside Dragius, which is a bit of a shame, but I can understand why you wouldn't want people doing that. Next up, we have Royal Rebels Growl. So this is one of our level 6 Royal Rebel monsters. During the turn, you normal summon this card by attributing a level 5 or higher monster, send the top card of your deck to the graveyard. So that, again, is a bit of an annoying requirement. We can use our drive to try and facilitate making this be a little bit easier. We don't really want to summon a monster, tribute over it for a level 5 monster, and then tribute over it again to get out a Growl, because at that point, it's basically a 2 tribute monster that's only got 1800 attack, which is not great. But its effect is, one face-up level 8 or lower monster on your opponent's field loses attack and defense equal to its level times 200. So if we hit, for example, a Keto, which is a level 8 monster, 8 times 2 is 16, so it will lose 1600 attack and go down to 900 attack. Same with Dragius, except Dragius is level 7, so it'll be 200 higher than that, which means it will be 1100 attack, which means our Growl will be able to attack over it very easily. It's a decent boss monster for now, but realistically this card is going to get power crept and will immediately fall out of this deck as soon as we get anything remotely better. Next up, we have 3 Currybot. Just being able to get cards to our hand is really, really good. To use our Palace Gargoyle effect, we have to discard a card. To use our skill, sometimes we'll have to discard a card. And we're still going to want to have access to a lot of cards to use as tribute fodder to get out our heavy metal or get out our level 5s and 6s, such as Growl. So Currybot is always going to be a really good pick. Next up, Royal Rebels Rocker. During the turn you normal summon this card, add a level 6 or higher fiend monster from your graveyard to your hand. You cannot attack directly. So this card is really, really good because we can get back our cards for free. We don't have to pay anything. But it is also really, really bad because we can't attack directly. And one of the best things about Royal Rebels Heavy Metal is that we can pop monsters to be able to get a direct attack in. But Rocker basically says we can't do that. So Rocker is more of a setup or board break card rather than a finisher or a combo piece to try and end the game. That's just unfortunately not what this card is there for. Next up, we have Royal Rebel Shout. So if your opponent has a face-up level 7 or higher monster on the field, send one card from your hand to the graveyard, send up to 2 random cards from your opponent's hand to the graveyard. Now this effect is pretty useless. There are certain situations where this does come up and can be really useful. For example, if your opponent has 5 or more cards in their hand, you want to discard them down so they don't draw up to 6 or 7 during their next turn. So that can be really good. Other than that, the only reason this card is in here is because it is a level 4 light monster, which means we can boost it up using Royal Rebels Heavy Drive. Next up, one of the actual really good cards in the deck, Palace Gargoyle. So send a card from your hand to the graveyard, increase this card's level by 1 to the end of the turn. Now, obviously losing a card is not great, but being able to trigger the Royal Rebels Heavy Metal effect can be invaluable depending on the situation. Worst case scenario, you can just set this and have it just be a chump blocker and it's fine. Best case scenario, it turns on the entire deck and lets you win the game. Next up, we do have the Luminous Parrot, who's a bit weird in here, but if your opponent has 2 or more face-up monsters on the field, send top card of the deck to the graveyard, the attribute of 1 face-up monster on your opponent's field becomes light. Now this can come up in that sometimes you will not have a card that you need to be in your graveyard. So for example, we might really need to find a Royal Rebels Growl. So if we have Royal Rebels Rocker, we have access to our graveyard to get back our Growl, but Growl isn't in the graveyard. We can use Parrot's effect to send the top card to the graveyard, hope that it's Growl, and then use Rocker to put it back in our hand. Again, it's very niche, but it will come up occasionally. Other than that, again, Parrot is just in here to be used with Royal Rebels Heavy Drive. Next up, Thunder the Thunder, just a fantastic card all round. It's basically a staple at this point. Being able to weaken monsters' attack is very, very good, especially when we have something like Heavy Metal, which is 25, which means we can make our opponent's 25s 22 and try and attack into them, but we do not have to play around the barrier, which can cause problems because the barrier will still make our Royal Rebels Heavy Metal die, even if we do use Thunder the Thunder's effect. Next up, Summon Skull. It's just a good card. Our skill limits us to using fiends, so we're on this fiend, and occasionally we will use this as a tribute fodder to get out heavy metal to try and close out games. And then finally for monsters, we have Nessus the Star Knight, which is just a 1500 fiend light monster. Again, this is in here just to be a bit of extra muscle because all of our 1400 pluses have to be fiends. Next up, we have Ghost Cyclone. So if we have no monsters on our field, we can destroy 1 spell trap on your opponent's field. Then if you have 3 or less monsters in your graveyard, you can draw 1 card. So the draw is obviously very, very good, but we shouldn't expect to get the effect off very often. For the most part, just treat this as like a Mystical Space Typhoon. We want to use this just to pop one of our own back row, but we don't have to discard a card like we do with Hammer Crush. Now, sometimes having those monsters in the way is going to be annoying, but a lot of the time your opponent will be destroying all of your monsters, so you will have this card alive a lot of the time. Next up, a staple, an actual factual staple card. There is no reason any deck has to not be running Widespread Ruin. This card is so very strong. When an opponent's monster declares an attack, destroy 1 attack position monster with the highest attack on your opponent's field. It is just insane. It's a legend, which means we can only run 1 of it, but it is very, very strong, and every deck will be playing this card in future. It's also next to impossible to play around, so it's just that good. And then finally, we are on Music Princess's Recital. So when an opponent's level 8 or lower monster declares an attack while you have 1 face-up monster on your field, negate the attack. So this card is a bit wonky. It is really good at keeping you in the game and can be really good at protecting your 2500 attack monsters if you've only got the 1. The primary way you'll use this card is that you'll just have 3 monsters out, and then 2 of them will get picked off, and then you'll try and save the 3rd. That is the primary use for this card. If you use this on a Dragius, you'll be able to stop its first attack, ideally assuming its first attack is going on your only monster, therefore preventing the 25 direct damage, which is pretty good. But the main reason we're on this is because the barrier doesn't work very well with this deck. The barrier is really good when you're running a lot of 2500 attack monsters, but because of our restriction, the only 25s we're allowed to run is our 3 Royal Rebels Heavy Metal and our Summon Skull. So because of that, we've cut down on the barriers because it doesn't gel very well with this deck, but Music Princess's Recital is still very, very good. So let's talk a little bit about this deck. It's like its strengths and weaknesses. So the obvious weakness is this deck runs a lot of high level monsters. We are on 3 level 8s, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 1-tribute monsters, which is only 8, which is not the end of the world, but because of the way this deck plays and that you kind of want to be sacrificing other high-level monsters to get things going, it can get a little bit wonky, on top of the fact that you're losing advantage here and there by using things like Heavy Drive if we went first, or if we're using Palace Gargoyle's effect. So the deck can get a little bit bricky. Originally, we were playing a lot more high levels, but we found that it was getting a little bit too bricky, so we've cut down to the numbers that we are on now. The next big weakness of the deck is that we don't really have a good way to get to our opponent's life points. If our opponent just sets 3 cards, we don't have any piercing, we don't have any multi-attack, and we don't have any way to destroy our opponent's face-down monsters, which does mean we have a similar problem to what the Volt Condor deck has, which is it's a very good counter-attacking deck, but not a very strong proactive deck. And that's also how the Royal Rebels feel. You don't really want to be summoning out your Royal Rebels Heavy Metal and just leaving it in attack mode because you want to be using its effect. Now you can summon it out because 2500 attack is still a decent attack, but a lot of things will be able to get over it. Think Seven's Red Magician, think the new Ancient Arise Dragon, think your opponent's copies of Royal Rebel Heavy Metal. There's just a lot of things that can just damage this card, and that's why you always kind of want to be on the counter attack. Let your opponent attack into you, try and bear the brunt of the attack, and then attack them back and try and blast them out. But this deck does have also quite a lot of strength. It is very good at clearing monsters, it's very good at gaining a lot of attack, and it's pretty good at playing around your opponent's copies of the barrier. The barrier works best when 2500 monsters try and attack other 2500 monsters, and you can try and change these numbers a little bit, right? So for example, you could use Thunder the Thunder to weaken something by 300 and then think you're going to get over and then barrier stops you. Or you could have a monster like Prima Gitana, which has 2200 attack into it with a 25, thinking, well, I'm 300 higher, and then they flip over the barrier and your monster gets destroyed. This deck, on the other hand, doesn't have to worry about that. We pop monsters with effects, we can gain a ton of attacks, so we're just too big for the barrier to matter, and using Growl, we can also weaken our opponent's monsters so they're so low that, again, we just don't care about barrier. But yeah, we're playing this deck a ton on stream today over at twitch.tv/Tomatosaurs. We were having a great time jamming it there. We will be doing another stream on Sunday, so the coming Sunday. I hope to see some of you there, where we'll be playing some of the other new decks from this format. And also, we have just opened up a brand new Discord server, so anyone that wants to join that, I will throw a link to that down in the description. But now, let's find some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.